Calm down before you stress up the groove. The energy a little different when the blessings accrue. Hey, who you talking to? Just know I ain't no regular fool. Could be anything in the world, but I can never be you. Don't you, ooh. I ain't surprised at all. Seen them rise and fall. Went up the mountain, it wasn't hard to climb at all. At the top, I found some relief. I finally got some peace. Carry on, but please don't mess up the mood. Yeah.
Welcome to Time Out, powered by Evo 3 Sports. We are your hosts, Mark Thomas.
And I'm Mike Houlihan. We are the co-founders of Evo 3 Sports, a multimedia platform acting as a headquarters for coaches and athletes to share knowledge, network, and support athletic communities. Go to evo3sports.com to sign up for our monthly newsletter, Coaches Meeting. Check out our previous quick clips for coaching advice, and sign up for upcoming coaching and athletic educational programs. Follow us on evo3sports.com. Also follow us at Evo3Sports on Instagram, Facebook. Evo3 Sports, built for change.
So we'll start with our first segment, warm up. So in this segment, we will discuss current events that impact the coaching world. So what's the warm up today, Mike?
Today I want to talk about increasing efficiency when it comes to training. As coaches typically ask, right, how do we make our practices more efficient, right? Not only throughout the entire year, but day to day. What are some ways that you really try to kind of dial into the efficiency in terms of your practice?
Yeah, well, for me, it goes in a few different ways, okay. Especially since for us, we're really restricted with time. We only get 2 hours, 4 to 6 p.m. That's all we get for training.
Including your lifts and everything?
Yes, everything has to be, for the most part, put into that time frame just because of their schedules.
Yeah.
So this is always something that I'm consistently working on trying to get faster at and having faster transitions. Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I'm always doing is just making sure that the staff is as well prepared as possible to have practice run efficiently. Half the battle sometimes is just letting coaches take a court and run a drill, but if they don't know it entirely, it's not going to run the way, one, that you want it to, and two, in a manner that your athletes are getting really something out of it. So just making sure that everyone has their questions answered for the actual practice plan. I'll review the drills, and for me, I have no shame. Like if you completely forget a drill that we've done 1,000 times, it's okay to ask me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some coaches aren't like that. They get kind of mad. It's like, oh my gosh, we've done this 100 times. But for me, I'd rather you check in with me and be like, hey, are you sure? It goes this way, right? Mm-hmm. So just making sure that the whole staff knows what's going on entirely really does help to make things run a little bit faster. From drill to 6v6, so on and so forth. What about you?
Yeah, it's 100% prep. That's what it is. I feel like it really comes down to prep, and I feel like if you aren't getting what you need to be done in practice, videotape your practice, right?
Yeah.
Just figure out where are those time slots, how long are they really, right? Are you really kind of wasting time by collaborating with coaches while players surround you, right? Things of that nature. It's really big that so what we do is we have a entire planning sheet, and what that planning sheet, it's sectioned by drills. What it does is it gives the overall time in which it should be in practice. So like 5 o'clock to 5:15 or whatever it might be. Then there's a breakdown in time, right? How should the segments of the drill go? Then it's a description. So we also whiteboard everything, which I find to be extremely important because it's very easy. Not only, it's multiple reasons. One of them is efficiency. It's holding you accountable in front of everybody that this is our times, this is what we're going to do, and then don't extend out that time. All right, that's the other part. The other part, too, is players in terms of their mental kind of preparation for it and things like that. But that's not here and there. But then the sheet also has responsibilities. Who's responsible for what, right? Are you hitting in this drill? Are you, as a coach, right? Are you tossing balls? Again, so as many of those factors as we can kind of get settled out prior to practice makes it so much easier.
Definitely.
I think that's huge. And then another thing that you don't really, like, you think about it, but you got to kind of religiously think that I have to follow it, is a clock.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it be above on a scoreboard in your watch or your phone or whatever you need to do, stick to it.
For sure.
Right? I mean, the other part is I feel like you got to realize too when something's not working. So I feel like sometimes you extend drills to make it work. Sometimes just keep to your timeline, right?
Yeah.
I think efficiency is huge, but the number one thing I do want to kind of bring up is the idea of water breaks.
Okay.
Water breaks are important. Make sure that you give yourself time to separate from players so that way you can debrief everything that just happened and then prep for the next drill again, essentially, right? Whether it be getting boxes where they need to be, understanding the drills so that way when players come around, we're all on the same page. Here's the drill, boom, 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 get into it, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things in terms of water breaks that you can actually do while you're actually drinking water, right? Hydrate up out there. I get it. I'm not trying to take that away from you. But it's really important that you utilize that time in a way to create the efficiency that you need to.
Definitely. That's something that we're always striving to improve is what it is that we are doing while the team is grabbing water. I don't, I do this on purpose. I don't have our team help set up. I tell them, hey, go grab water. That's their thing is to get hydrated, but as quickly as possible. And the staff's responsibility is to be setting everything up for that next drill. If you need water, yeah, absolutely. But more often than not, what actually ends up happening now is, at least in my gym, I'm able to dictate, who should be doing what for the setup, even to that point for the, in between water breaks, just so that way everyone knows exactly what it is that they're doing to make sure that everything's set up on time. I mean, you could have accidentally two coaches just working on, getting volleyballs together when the rest of the other two courts still have to get set up, right?
Yeah.
And so the more specific I can be, and that's to your point, like you were saying earlier, when you actually plan your practices, having like where everyone's going to be, the more planned that you can have everything, the faster practices are naturally going to run.
Yeah.
It's really funny, my team, it's almost like if we have a breakdown and they feel like the breakdown is almost like super slow.
Yeah.
Because everything else throughout the course of practice, it feels like it's go, go, go. And I'm sure, yeah, there is an element of that to it. But also at the same time, I set that tone because that's the tone that we need for game-like scenarios as well. A lot of people lose sight of that, where, we're not just jogging to save time in between, practice reps and stuff like that, but it's also like your hustle in general. If you're walking to your spot or anything like that, you're losing time for you to mentally and physically prepare in a game. So for us, I almost utilize it like it's life skill development or teachable moments. And we've had podcasts where we've talked about, answer the why. And so I can actually break that down as to why it is that we are being efficient even during water breaks. So I definitely hone in on that too. But I think another thing is just, again, that understanding of how long a drill is actually going to take.
Yeah.
So we talked about, writing down maybe the timeline, especially on the debrief component, so that way in the future you know how long that drill actually takes to do. Some coaches really, will stick to that, hey, we're not moving on until we accomplish this.
Succeed.
Well, if you're doing that, then just make sure that you have the correct amount of time allotted for that. There are some drills out there, or even like 6v6 games, that
may never end.
My gosh, I mean, wash drills and stuff like that, and sometimes you don't account for how long it's going to take to complete the drill. And not only does it mess up the rest of practice, but it actually kind of messes with the psyche of the athlete too, depending upon how you transition to the next thing, if you're transitioning to the next thing. I mean, I'm a believer that there's nothing worse than having this drill just stop.
I know.
And that's just it. And we don't have either a winner or loser, or we didn't accomplish a goal or not, and reflect on that. And so I've always just felt that the second I go through a drill or whatever, especially if it's the first time, I'm definitely writing down how long that drill took, but also the challenges that they experienced in it, so that way I can make modifications, so that way maybe in the future they can accomplish it in that shorter period of time.
Yeah. I think another way too is you got to look at things is going on to that point, you have to realize, again, priorities, right? What drills have to be finished? What drills don't necessarily have to be finished? I think that's one thing, and you got to prioritize that as you guys, as coaches, you have when you're planning the practice. I think the final part that I want to add to this is realize too, like when you're doing fundamentals, maybe don't do them for numbers, do them for time, right? Because again, that sets those very easy efficiency marks of this is the time slot, this is what we have, and then break them down from there. I think that's very important. I think knowing that if you put it on a whiteboard and everyone knows where they're going, it eliminates that need for communication verbally that takes up time. So
absolutely,
a lot of different ways to do it, but efficiency in my eyes is the number one thing as a coach when you're planning practice.
I wholeheartedly agree. We want to reach as many people as possible and expand the Evo 3 community. Please like and subscribe to Time Out wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. Leave a 5-star review, take a photo, and if you tag at Evo 3 Sports on Instagram or Facebook with the photo as proof, we'll send you an Evo 3 decal. So this is just a fun way of showing your support, and I actually love the fact that there's 2 stickers and they come in a pack, so you can actually split them up, you can keep them together, but we just want to show our appreciation for the fans of this podcast. If you are a coach or a club director that wants to add a team handbook for coaches and athletes in their program, check out Evo 3's new team handbooks. We've made stock handbooks and can actually make custom handbooks designed for up to 3 levels within a program, ranging from introductory and basic levels to elite programs. You can purchase these handbooks on our website, evo3sports.com. That's EVO, the number 3, sports.com.
All right. As a coach, when you watch game film, you're looking to improve both yourself and your team. We named this segment Game Film as we discuss systems and concepts we've either used in the past or we're intrigued about using in the future. Mark, what did you want to kind of bring to the table today?
All right. So for game film, the other part of this episode is tempo, right? And actually in the past, we've touched upon how, your defense can actually make your offense more efficient. And so I actually thought that we could kind of dive in more into that, especially since I actually had some coaches ask me more about that and to go into depth. So, how is it that you actually prepare your defensive system to have a faster offensive system?
So it's all about positioning. I think that's the number one thing. So a lot of people, and again, we touch base, so thank you to everybody who wanted us to kind of keep going down this route, but it is extremely important to set up what happens kind of beforehand if you want high success with what happens afterwards, and that comes into defense into offense transition. So if tempo is what you really want to run and you want to spread it from pin to pin, you have to set your players up in order to do so. I find that to be important.
Yeah.
One of the ways is, again, your defense. Where do people end up? So a lot of people talk about the idea of making sure that your libero is in a position that they can get as much digs as possible. But they don't expand it to everybody else, right?
Right.
And there's 2 really big concepts. If you're going to run tempo, you got to realize the first thing. You don't have to run passing tempo. Right? Passing tempo can be higher. You do not have to run it, because I think for me, the main part of tempo that makes it kind of applicable and usable is the idea that you're going to make it harder for blockers. When you're running passing or defensive tempo, right, when you're passing a ball at a lower pace, I don't find it to be very important in the passing aspect of it, because everyone's pretty much set up where they want to be. Some people want to run a quicker ball defensively, because with that said, I think it's a matter of how chaotic is the other side and how quick can you kind of get a swing on them.
Yeah.
But if you're running tempo in terms of the way you run your offense, I find that you want to provide time for your offense to get where it needs to be and get a good swing, and then let the ball do the work in terms of splitting blocks, splitting blockers, things of that nature. So when you're looking at it, right, you look at your defensive system, you have to look at your libero because you want digs out of them. Now expand that. where do you want your setter releasing from, right? Where do you want your two pin players releasing from, right? Very important. Are you running a pipe or are you not running a pipe? Because if you're running a pipe, and you have to make sure that you know where that person is coming from, right? Are they coming up? So like one thing that always bothers me is like if you have a front court setter and you're running a D ball, and then you have that player come up for the tips, and then they come all the way up for the tips, and then they have to go all the way back and then have a good efficient swing. Hard to do.
Very.
Right? So it all goes back to your priorities, right? Are you defensive driven or are you going to be offensive driven, right? And then if you're offensive driven, like my team is, yes, we need to cherish defense and we have to get digs and things of that nature, but we have to set them up so the transition works for our offense. Obviously, anything else you kind of comes to mind for you?
Really to emphasize what it is that you're saying, even if you're not offensive minded, right? This is a good mentality to have if your team maybe struggles offensively, because at times we don't realize how much work they're doing in transition. And then by the time, like you said before, they actually get outside the court, are they actually in a good position to swing? Are they tempo-wise on time? More often than not, they are not, right? Especially when you have your off-blocker curling. It's really challenging to do that. Now, don't get me wrong. If your strategy is that, hey, maybe in the second third of our match, we want to start having more inside sets for our pin blockers. Maybe I will have them curl to pick up that off-blocker ball, because then blockers are just maybe naturally thinking, oh, they're going to try to push that outside because maybe that's what we did in the first third of the match. And then at that point, all right, it's an inside set or something like that. We might move to that system if we're struggling even just in system as well, though, too. Maybe we need to have a different location for our pin attacker to go and go after it. So, yeah, I really think that the way that I approach it is almost athlete-wise, who is capable of doing what. You don't want to set some athletes up for failure just because you want the system to work, right? You can move different players in your defensive system as well. And sometimes I think coaches lose sight of that. They're so focused on, well, this is the structure. This is how it has to work. But realistically, again, if your defensive players have to transition and be an offensive option for you, it really is about where they are when a ball is being attacked, so that way they can be in a good position to actually go after it.
And I think that's huge. And again, you could be defensive-minded over offensive-minded. What you have to do, though, then is place your players defensively where you want them and then build your offense around it.
Exactly.
So like you're talking about, like essentially like we might be running inside plays. What else you can do, right? You're bringing a pin, the outside, let's say, across to cover tips, right? Maybe then you start working on 32s, but you come at a sharper, different type of angle, right? So that way you essentially come to a sharp angle and hit essentially the other side's one spot, right? By creating those angles properly, you can create an offense around it. Same thing, right? You're bringing your right side across. That works. Start teaching them to run slides, right? Create that efficiency in their footwork that they don't have to get all the way outside the court and all the way back in. I think one of the main parts that you really kind of can't really control is that middle, right? Right. If you can't be, and for us, we really talk about the idea of most of the time, unless it's a free ball, right? We kind of establish what our free ball play should look like. At a transition, you have to really open up your setters to being more kind of verbally aware. Allow your middles to make the call, right? So if middles are going, let's say, to block the other team's right side, so they're going to your outside, let them be able to call that as a 3-ball versus a 1-ball. Same thing, if they go on the outside, let them call a 1-ball, and maybe you pre-set up a 3, but that's a very difficult kind of path to take.
Challenging angle, yeah.
Especially when the setter's crossing into the area. There's a lot of crossing that way. So let's start verbalizing more out of the middle. So what we do is we break it out where unless it's a free ball play, we verbal out middle calls, right side calls, outside of calls. So by doing that, it allows our middles to essentially make the call of whether they're going to run a B or a tight, a 1, or come around for a 3-ball, whatever it might be. And then from that, right, especially if middle's running a 3-ball, let's say, we can have our right side call whether they're going to run a red or they're going to come in for a tight ball or they're going to come in for a 1, and then our outside can kind of adjust with that as well, right? So create some kind of verbal and understanding communication that, like, you give setters kind of the permission to call everything off. Well, I think you have to give hitters the same opportunity because they're going to know whether they can make the run as well.
Definitely.
Versus the setter knowing it at all times. So it's got to be a two-way street kind of conversation. And transition to me is about stealing points, right?
Yeah.
You get an opportunity that you're not supposed to get technically. So by stealing points, make sure you up the communication so that way you can run something that maybe isn't as consistent, but it's essentially going to be more connective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, the part that I really enjoy about that the most is just the ability to, you're also establishing the, not chain of command, but the line of communication and how we should be reacting to things. So now you almost set up, you know how we'd always talk about, hey, middles and pins should be communicating about how many hitters are on the other side and stuff like that. But you're establishing a new phase of communication for your offensive system to be successful, established by middle first, just because they have to pull first before anyone else does. So I actually really enjoy that. What we've done in the past is drill-wise, you know, it'll be free ball, down ball type stuff, and audibles. So it's the exact same thing. We tend to focus more so on one attacker. I'm actually really excited to kind of use that and see, you know, how do our pins react after the middle makes that first call. So I'm going to steal that from you. Yeah,
you should. I mean, we do it all the time. What we do is we don't allow setters to make a call. We do it off of a free ball. I alluded to it at a quick clip as well, but we don't essentially let the setters make any call. And what happens is your middle calls, your right side calls, and then your outside calls. And all of them have to start thinking right away. Setters don't know anything that's happening. So by doing that, it's amplified the scenario, right? But what the number one thing you have to do is also, again, I think at first, right? It's about building, like we talk about. We want to build up the process. So provide them opportunities and say, like, these are your sets you get to choose from. You can't give them wide open stuff. Like, you can't have a middle say, I'm going to run a slide, and then your right side be like, now what, right? Right?
Definitely
Threes,
giving them
ones, and
multiple
tights,
options, but
right?
not everything. Yeah,
so middles, 3, 1s, and tight. Right side, I normally try to say reds. If the middle's not doing tight, run a tight, or 1, depending on that call. And then the outside, same thing. You're talking an outside ball to essentially maybe a 32 to a 2-ball around there.
Yeah. Well, so that being said, before we end this segment, are there any, I guess, tips or recommendations for coaches out there that are kind of looking to implement this for their system?
Yeah, really think about in terms of placement, right? How do you want people to be placed? But I think the number one thing is give it time, right? If you're going to kind of introduce this idea of bringing quicker tempos and things of that nature, really think through how things build up in the game and shift through, and then give it time to be implemented, right? They're not going to take verbal cues that quickly. So make sure that you really focus on giving the time that's needed to make it actually work.
Yeah, I think that it's certainly something that I think coaches tend to overview sometimes, right, is just how long is it actually going to take to get this going, the amount of questions that you're going to get from players, but when you get to actually show them visually on court why it is that we're changing to these systems and how it's going to help the offense, they usually get pretty excited about that. So I always tend to just be okay with the answering the why, essentially.
Yeah. All right. Do you have a product or business that benefits athletes or coaches, maybe upcoming camps, tryouts, or tournaments, if you want to spread the word about? Advertise them here. Timeout Evo 3 Sports is offering sponsorship and advertising opportunities on our podcast. If you want to expand your business's reach email volleyball@evo3sports to discuss timeouts marketing options. Again, that's volleyball@evo3sports.com. Email us today and boost your presence in the athletic communities. All right. So moving on to our next segment, Talking Shop.
Okay, so in this segment, we'll discuss the title of this month's podcast, which is Tempo and Efficiency. There's many reasons why coaches look to improve their offensive tempo, right? We went into setting up the defensive system for the offense, for a faster tempo offensive system. But, just to start our conversation here, what are some major reasons for you, Mike, as to why you try to focus on having better offensive tempo?
Yeah. So to me, the offensive tempo is, I think the number one thing that bothers me the most is the idea that, especially at Division III women's and things of that nature, people talk about the idea that it can't be done, right? Athletics, things of that nature. But in terms of it, I think the number one thing I want to kind of emphasize is the idea that it doesn't have to be pretty.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's got to be effective. Much different. So when you come to this level, you tend not to always have people that will kind of bang and put the ball up and over a block. And so by creating tempo, it allows for you to find holes, create holes, hit spots. So you can create almost a machine gun type of mentality of just rapid pace coming in. You better get to your spots because we're going to hit them.
Yeah.
Right? I think there's a lot to it in that sense. The major reason for us is that purpose. We're going to create opportunities by creating holes. We're going to create opportunities by creating confusion, creating these sharp cuts. So when I talk about tempo, it's also about how quick the other side sees things developing. So we're really big about the idea of really cutting off someone's shoulder versus really looping and things of that nature. So we try to make things the little amount of movement that creates big opportunities in that sense.
Definitely.
But for us, it's really about creating the hole in the block and be able to hit those heat seams and be able to find those opportunities in that way.
Yeah, we always talk about creating one-on-ones, and that's not just from the setter's perspective, right? Of course, the setter dictates that to start. But realistically, if we're running a faster offensive tempo, we're creating one-on-ones because the block isn't actually able to close. And that's the way that we approach it, right? I love the fact that you talk about that it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't. And for me as a coach, unpredictability is big for me. I want teams to struggle scouting our offensive system. So what is more unpredictable than honestly slicing for kills?
Yeah.
If you really think about it. And what you are doing from a training perspective, you're not necessarily having athletes try to, hit specific spots, more so attack the gap in the block, because if there's a gap in the block, the defense has a natural challenging time to be able to read that and fill the gap and get to the right spot, right? So if we just find holes in the block and we're talking about attacking the gap, that's a big phrase that we'll use in my gym, because if you're attacking the gap more often than not, you're actually going to be getting a high percentage kill. And to your point earlier, when we talk about maybe longer rallies from an average perspective at our level in D3, the best way, or at least what we should be doing, is trying to figure out, well, then how do we make these shorter? How do we put the ball away as quickly as possible if we don't have someone that has like a gigantic shoulder can just destroy the ball? We have to be a little bit more strategic as to how we're going to earn points. That's what it's all about. It's not highlight reels. It's just getting 1 point at a time.
Yeah. And by running that tempo, you allow less reading time. So we talk about that all the time, right? For the other side, defensively, you want to get to where you want to be as quick as possible so you can get up, be neutral, and be able to read. So by increasing the tempo, if you have another team that has a ton of movement, right, like a rotational defense or something like that, you're eliminating that read time.
Yeah.
So the gaps become a lot more vulnerable on their side. And that's important. And I think that's huge. And for us, it's really about teaching players the accountability of finding the gap.
Yeah.
That's the biggest part, because like you said, you're running tempo, you're creating gaps. you have to make sure that you're understanding where the gaps are and then upping the communication with our libero to the hitter or someone who's behind coverage and things of that nature, and being able to kind of show and tell people like no block, one block, right? Things of that nature.
Well, tempo can't exist without communication. I'm a big believer in that. It's if the communication isn't consistent, you're always going to have a lapse somewhere, even from the step that you should be on for the tempo that you're trying to run, for example. Speaking of which, actually, so what are some common ways that you try to implement faster tempo in your gym?
So it is really kind of difficult at times because you got a lot of kids coming in with much higher kind of sets that they're used to, things of that nature. I think the number one thing is make sure your setters understand it first.
Yeah.
That is important because I feel like when it comes to that kind of thing, you can't have setters up and down, up and down, up and downs, because the number one thing that's difficult is essentially your attacker's timing.
Yeah.
That's what it's really all about. So you have to be able to provide as much as you can. So yeah, I understand the idea of putting up a hittable ball and things like that, but you really gonna have to just get your setters used to that tempo as much as possible before you implement that hitter, essentially. So by doing that, you can help them kind of sync their timing. I find that be very important. So that's pre-hit, right?
Yeah.
Another one that comes prior to the hit, I mentioned it earlier, is passing, right? There's no need not to drive a ball high.
Right.
Drive the ball high, whether it's a dig, whether it's an actual pass and serve receive, right? There's no need to be shooting balls at the setter and then expect
To
tempo.
push tempo from there.
Right? I'm a huge believer. If you can do both, huge.
Right.
National championship kind of quality. Like, I get it. But if not, you got to pick one or the other. You got to run tempo on your passing, or you have to run tempo on your swings.
And what's going to be the most consistent out of that?
I find it to be tempo from the setter,
Yeah.
more than anything, because
Exactly.
I think you only have to rely on a small group of players, setters, to be able to make that type of tempo versus a passing tempo needs to be done by all passers on and off the court. So
Yeah.
but those are two parts that we kind of really talk about before we even get into actually running them. What do you do?
Well, first, before I even go into something different, I want to reiterate essentially what you're talking about. I can't tell you how many times that and I'm guilty of this as a coach, like trying to implement a new first tempo swing or attack,
Okay.
right? Super excited, get into the gym. All right, we got our first breakdown, setters and attackers, right? And if the setters haven't had the time to learn technically how to set the ball accurately and in the same location every time, you're going to have two people trying to make changes every single rally.
Yep.
If the attackers are trying to change something because the setter is providing them a different style of ball, for example, now the setter's trying to correct that.
Hitters too.
And now the hitter's also trying to react to the last set they got, which the setter is trying to change. So that was something that when I realized what was going on, it meant a lot to how efficiently we learned first tempo attacks after, when I gave setters the opportunity to just, really hone in on, okay, this is where it needs to be. This is the tempo. We work with a stopwatch, with the timing. So that way it really does help with the height and pace of where that ball is at its peak. But also just from a confidence perspective, now setters go in and we're going to be working on goes today. Awesome. That we've been working on goes with the setters maybe for 3 practices prior before we actually got to this point. So I think it is really important to actually give your setters the opportunity to work on that on their own. I also train to run things faster and more efficiently, both in and out of system.
Yeah.
A common theme that comes up is, oh my gosh, we have a bad pass. Now what do I do? And so what I like to do is Of course, in system, we want to make sure that that's consistent. But once we feel like we have things slightly clicking, I'll then add out of system types of drills or breakdowns. So that way we're still learning how to run first tempo on bad passes. Or we're learning how to audible into something that's still going to be very efficient from an offensive perspective. And we actually are learning about reading, right? You're increasing their volleyball IQ that way. So, another thing that I guess I would be adding on to this would be, for as much time as I dedicate to in-system learning how to do this, I actually will train first tempo with out-of-system work more over time than I do in-system.
So a couple of points. Adding on to that factor, we really track the idea in terms of how often are we in system versus how often, right? Percentage-wise. Are we in system 50% of the time, 60% of the time, 40% of the time? And that's how we practice.
Absolutely.
So if players want to hit in system in practice, then they got to get in system in matches and training and things of that nature. So we do that right off the bat. There's a couple of things though. So we alluded to the idea that you need to train the setters first, but then what do you do with your hitters? So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. So we have a system that we do. So we'll take and separate people. We'll toss little 2 balls to the hitters, right?
Yeah.
That allows them to, and we do it from the 4 spot, right? Little 2 balls so that they can just see quicker tempo type of stuff without a setter. You can put hitters on a box. Put hitters on a box at the pin and let them work on their arm swings, and then setters have to set normal, right? That's a big way as well. We're pretty fortunate. We do have something called NOAA. NOAA is huge. It allows for us to track setters, and they provide insight in terms of the path of each ball, right? That's important for us. But with that said, not a lot of people have that. So utilizing some of these other things. Now, in terms of in-system and out-of-system, what we also do is we create an elastic, or we put an elastic on the pins, and we put it around our setters. So what happens is we're giving them that visual. So having our setters come off the net, you see the line that it's created.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So we do this a lot with our middles particularly. And the number one thing when you're doing off net, out of system type of tempo, you got to make sure that we're looking at each other essentially shoulder to shoulders, chest to chest. You really got to open up to them. You can't close off like you could essentially on a higher ball. Very, very important concept, right? Show that you're open. And by having the elastic, right, it allows for our setters to come way off the net, and you still see that line of sight. It helps the setters in terms of knowing that they still have to square, right? You got to square down that line that you create with the elastic, as well as opens up our hitters to understand, all right, I still have to follow that line and essentially get eye work in terms of see her eyes, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And so I love that visual. As a coach, I also utilize that often. I will say it is annoying
100%.
for setters to actually be inside of that string. Sometimes they'll get so caught up in what it feels like, but realistically, it's a fantastic visual for them. And the other side of it, now when you get into in and out of system work and you feel really confident about that, I always want to add a defensive system against it. That's my last part, right? Before I go into maybe some live 6v6 work with it, I'll add a block first. So that way we're learning how to hit around the block with first tempo timing. And then I'll add defenders second. So that way, you got past the block. That's great. But if you're hitting to these exact locations where defenders are going to be, that's a challenge. And then I'll even add on to that, the defensive system is changing defensive systems. So that way, okay, we worked on maybe goes against a perimeter defense yesterday. Let's work on goes against a rotational defense today. Let's see what that's like. Let's see some of the challenges that you're going to face, but also see where the opportunities are on the court so that you're really getting to not only make sure that your timing is good, but your execution is better.
Now, I think the last point I kind of want to add to this little segment is the idea of defensively. You step from your court into a match. Not everybody runs tempo.
Yeah.
you have to be able to teach your players to adjust, especially on the block. Middles really tend to close and jump and things because the tempo that they see in practice is so different.
Yeah.
So make sure that you're kind of adjusting to it, and you're letting players understand the difference in terms of tempos, because you're going to need it, because it's going to be different almost team to team. So really make sure that we're not just getting into this, we're extremely fast because our offense is fast. You make sure you're really kind of diving into the blocking aspect of having the pin find the ball, having the middle close to the pin, essentially.
And the communication that goes along with that, though, too.
100%, because that's big. It's important.
Definitely. It's been very interesting for me. I love that you brought that up, because how many times we've seen especially the faster our system is, the more challenging it becomes for our defensive system, especially the block, to be on time.
Yeah.
From a back row perspective, of course, I want them to continue getting there faster, because then they have more time, right? But for the block, your timing is everything. So if you're going up too early, you could do a phenomenal job of closing, but then
Doesn't
by the time
matter.
exactly now your defenders are upset with you because you jumped too early. One way that I work on that is through wash drills.
Yep.
So maybe the first ball will be first tempo, right? And then the second ball, immediately I'm actually giving an out of system ball to a setter, maybe digging right back. So that way we're working on defensively, knowing how to go up against first tempo, but then also how to slow ourselves down, even to the point where it's an out of system ball that's set from the libero.
Yeah.
Right? It really helps them at least visualize and understand the range of tempo for the block, right? So now we know how fast we need to be for the fastest tempo. We also know how slow and methodical we have to be for out-of-system attacks. And then from that point, throughout the course of matches, at least for me, I've found that it's pretty helpful to match the tempo that we need to, at least having the range established. How about you?
Yeah, it's really about that idea of being able to, because the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want players to be hitting live balls as much at a different tempo than what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
That timing part is crucial. So with that said, you want to create those scenarios as naturally as you can while allowing blockers to adjust. So some of it does. It's going to have to come in wash drills. Some of it might have to come on, unfortunately, sometimes your scout team needs to adjust. And there's a lot to it, but you do need to make sure that you are capable of, again, it's about the reading, right? Whether they're fast tempo or slow tempo, right? You can't let your middles and your blockers and even your defense kind of get used to it because it's the pace that I have to do because I know we're going to do this, right? Or like same concept actually comes when you're running plays, right? And you can see things develop because you know the system, right? So there's some things that you need to kind of so we really kind of do this idea with reading the ball, where we're going to be setting up scenarios from boxes more than anything.
Okay.
And then what we'll do is, again, we'll put the hitters on the box, and we'll let the setters set different tempos. So now, again, they're going to read the ball versus anything, where now you're not really messing up the timing of hitters. I think that's the biggest part because you work so hard on the timing. Yes, they have to be adaptable to certain balls, but we don't want to continuously run high just to be offsetting our defense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it almost it can work against you. In that manner if you do have it that way. I also think that it helps with being on the box, that is. I think that's a great tool for attackers to help realize, even if they are either too early or too late, how they can still get on top of a ball or at least get a solid contact off of it. It gives them not only a visual, but like the feel of what that is like as well, so that way they know what to do with the ball when it's not perfectly in their window.
And I think that's a great point. So we add it into our handbook. It's the idea of multiple hitting points. Essentially, right? So when you're running tempo, you as a hitter, everyone's a little bit different athletically. So that's one, right? We got to get our setters to be consistent.
Same.
Right? Consistent in the way they set. But as a hitter, you got to visualize different hitting points based off of your own swing, your own tempo, your own whatnot. So it could be a foot out of bounds up to a foot inbounds, right?
Yeah.
So essentially what we did is we showed them the idea and the concept of how a ball would travel and the different areas into it. So understand, so what we do to make that easier, like we talked about, we go wider, right? So by getting wider, what we do is we teach our players that essentially where they're going to contact the ball is going to be determined based off of the stride that they take.
Yeah.
So if they realize that ball is traveling out, shorten the stride and be able to jump up and take swings versus elongating the stride, right? Where if you're coming in too much down the line, now you're adjusting almost horizontally.
And your step close is also facing the net.
Your step close is facing the net, right? If a ball's inside for your hitting height, you have to now take a step inward or a step outward, where if you're coming wider, you're more of just taking either a longer step that will kind of cover area kind of horizontally, I guess, if that
But it helps to keep the ball in front of you. That's the best part about staying wide is I would rather be in a position to change the strides of my approach forward in comparison to now it's not only the distance from the net, but then you're trying to figure out the distance to the ball. Yeah. It's just another thing that you're adding on to that makes it a little bit more challenging to get in the right spot, especially especially for maybe a set that isn't in the location that you necessarily want.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is, kind of last point on that is understand the strengths of your athletes. Right?
Absolutely, you have to.
You have to. Your teams most likely are not professional. They're not 6'5" and can jump over the top, whatever it is. Right? Know your strengths. So yes, you probably see a lot of high-end volleyball where they're coming with a kind of coming from defense and coming narrow down the line or whatever it might be, but they're high athletes, very, very high athletes. So we got to make sure that we adjust volleyball in a way to fit the athlete versus trying to force volleyball traditionally onto who you have.
Yeah, well, just like we talked about in the segment with, setting up your defense, you can make small adjustments here and there. The whole system doesn't have to stay as is, right? Same thing for, when you're working on attacking and tempo, maybe someone's height on a shoot or a go to the pin is on the lower side if they're undersized, right? You just have to find what the strengths are of your athletes. Maybe they're vertical, even like some really broad jump. Some have more of a vertical jump. So however the athlete's style of attacking is that you have for each person, you have to find a way to fine-tune the tempo of the set so that way they can be successful.
You're
Absolutely. Right. Now, what about statistics?
Okay.
Do you happen to use stats as a way of either maybe setting a tone for your offensive tempo or maybe a goal for your offensive tempo?
Yeah, I mean, so the one thing I want to open up with stats is the idea that they're not going to be pretty at first. You got to grow into statistics. So when you look at things statistically, you can't always take like the entire year and see how your stats, right? You got to segment them out, right? We talk about the idea of planning throughout the year and understanding where we need to be. So by doing it statistically, you have to have cutoff points.
Yeah.
And be like, all right, this is the first quarter of our season statistically, second, third, and fourth, and see them as they develop and grow. At first, we really we talk more about the efficiency part, right? Not necessarily the kill part, it's the efficiency, right? How do we keep balls in play?
Yeah.
Right? That's what we really open up and start looking at. We want our hitters to understand the idea of, since we're running tempo, our goal and purpose is not necessarily to get a ball and put it away every single time. It's about rapid fire, right? Finding the holes, finding the areas. And you might get dug. But by lowering our error rate, we're going to be allowed to be able to find the holes and find the gaps and be able to put a ball away that way without having to hit 10-foot lines or hit, so that's what we really focus on. And again, I think it's really important to open up with that idea of give yourself 4 quarters of stats.
Yeah.
Where you ever like go to your box score and you say like, oh, look at all these stats. We're so low in here, but like look at your past 3 games, your past 4 games, whatever it ends up being. Right.
Well, yeah. I think the play-by-play is so much more beneficial at times than cumulative stats.
Yeah.
Just because you can see what happened set to set. And in volleyball, I feel like you have to approach it that way. If you're not making changes based off of, what happened in the set prior, you're going to be in trouble. So for me, it's always been, I love that you break it up into 4, essentially like a quarter system. I use stats daily.
Yeah.
Right? And do you as well?
I do.
Okay, so having stats daily and each position knowing what their statistical goals are.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of how I guess I would use stats to my benefit. Even if we are first learning something, I constantly stress you're going to get worse before you get better.
100%.
And honestly, one of the biggest challenges, at least for me as a coach, is helping attackers realize that just because you didn't get a kill doesn't mean that you didn't help us out greatly.
Yeah.
So with first tempo stuff, yes, your attacking percentage may be lower at first, but did you see what the result was of the play? Did we earn that point? Mm-hmm. Did you throw them out of system so they couldn't get a good swing? Did we get a free ball? Little things like that really help our athletes recognize that, oh yeah, just because I'm not getting that same high percentage swing that I might have on a more traditional swing that I'm more comfortable with, doesn't mean that I'm not being as effective. I'm still being very effective. And as a matter of fact, you're probably making it more challenging for the defense that way than just executing on a ball, killing it, and then they get to conserve energy for the next play.
So right here I have these are our offensive statistics that we give our players. Our goal is to have between 11 and 13 kills per set with no more than 5 hitting errors, 60% side out rate. Setters need to run essentially 35% efficiency out of an in-system ball, 20% efficiency out of system ball, and a 25% efficiency within a transition. Pin hitters, we want hitting about 250, where middles we want about 350. Okay.
Yeah.
Statistics, right? What does that mean? Nothing. That means nothing, right? These are points that we want to essentially hit.
Yeah.
So the big thing, though, as a coach, you need to understand the idea, and we talk about this with our players, is score sheets, statistics, they just need to balance.
Right.
Right. So if you're hitting, let's say, 200 and not 250 as a pin, all right, so that's great. I'm okay with that, but let's look at now the errors, right? How many errors all right, you're not producing errors. You're keeping the ball in play. You're providing more and more opportunity that way, right?
Yeah.
That's how you have to really balance. So when you're looking, and that's why for us, we talk about the idea that we just need to eliminate errors to start, right? Keep the ball in play, keep it moving. And then eventually, as we get comfortable with that, then we start swinging more and harder and harder. So when we open up our tempo, it's about timing. So by creating that timing at, let's say, 70% swing, you're going to eliminate errors because you're taking a 70%. And then what we do is we take that swing percentage and we hit it to 75, 80, 85, and then maybe with most players you max out at 85 to 90, right? We don't want kids just going up and gripping and ripping for everyone, every single ball. So understand the balance sheet and how it works, because then you can show players, you're not hitting our 250 mark, you're hitting a 200 mark, but you're doing X, Y, and Z, and you're not creating errors, right? And that way, again, that balances. Same thing, right? So we need a 60% side out rate, but it doesn't have to be first ball, right? People talk about first ball side out. Yeah, I agree. I would love first ball side out to be at 60%, things of that nature, but you just got to side out.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of creating these type of ideas and show players how you can manipulate wins and losses or points by not just sticking to high hitting percentage.
Right. And then being crushed
crushed when you don't
mentally
hit it.
or confidently wise when you don't actually achieve that.
And you're right. The end of play is important because if this kid is putting the ball into play 6 times or 4 times or whatever it is, and the other team ends up on an error, that's not going to reflect in any statistics for us. But the
At
other
all.
team has an error.
Exactly. When we talk about stat efficiency, you talk about balance, and to me, it's the balance that makes it efficient. It's not necessarily numbers that we have to attain. It's more so we almost do it like you can almost do it like a bar graph, right?
Yeah.
Where I mean, if you were to have all 6 skills, and depending upon the player, let's use middles for example. Maybe offensively they're not there. Maybe they're hitting like 150 for example, and we want them to be hitting at 300 or higher. But if they're giving us 2 blocks per set,
Points.
game changer, right? They are still an efficient person on the court essentially. Just because they are struggling offensively doesn't make them statistically inefficient. But if we have that balance in it, and if they have that mentality, they can actually focus on that to build their efficiency
But
overall.
before you dive even further, you also have to kind of look for the unstatables, right? Right. Just by keeping that ball in play, the middle becomes effectively a player that can essentially open up holes for the outsides, right? They don't have to be the ones putting it away, but by kind of keep running and keeping it in play and keeping running and right being that workhorse at some level, only hitting a 180, let's say, right? Low for a middle. We need higher, but they're just not, they're just not making errors, but they're keeping the ball in play. Now you have an outside that can come, hit a gap, and end a play.
Put it away,
right?
yeah.
It's the team aspect, those intangible stuff that you can't stat, that
Yeah,
you need to
definitely.
make them aware of that, look,
You're still helping us.
you're helping us.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you want to evolve with us, follow us at Evo3Sports on Instagram and Facebook, and be sure to check us out on our website, evo3sports.com. That's EVO, 3, sports.com. Evo3Sports, built for change.
I ain't surprised at all. Seen them rise and fall. Went up the mountain, it wasn't hard to climb at all. At the top, I found some relief. I finally got some peace. Carry on.